For those newer to Rotary, classifications used to be really important in terms of how clubs were structured. When Paul Harris started Rotary in 1905 with three other people, they were from different occupations. And as they expanded, they wanted to have a broad cross section of the community reflected in their clubs. And they didn't want to have one profession or one group dominating. And if there were too many, they would branch off to another club. This used to be rather strictly enforced in Rotary, but it's no longer. But it's important to know what your classification is because it tells something about you and helps us all get to know one another better. So we're not going to get a long biographical introduction this morning because that's going to come in the speech that we're about to hear shortly. But I did want to impart a bit of information that I know you would not hear from Bud in a few minutes. When Bud was getting his PhD in philosophy at Notre Dame, he would often go down to the local bar where he enjoyed beer and he liked to reflect and expound upon the great meanings of the important questions in life. In fact, he was well known then and fondly remembered now as Bud the Wiser. Please welcome my good friend and our fellow Rotarian who's going to make us all wiser in a few minutes.
Oh, Chuck, that's not too much. Oh, thanks. And I'll just add, you guys don't know this, but Chuck and I were roommates for 2 weeks in Tanzania, so we know a lot more about each other than any of you. And we're none the wiser. So classification talk. I've resisted this for 26 years, but Sheila talked me into it. I believe this is a picture of my first birthday and me enjoying my first birthday cake. My advice to the younger members is do your classification talk earlier. It's really harder when you get older because you have a longer story to tell. Thanks for the extra time. And you're also trying to make some sense of your life journey. So to organize and focus my narrative, I'm going to try to answer these 4 questions. What did I get from my larger Hammes family? What did I learn from my mother and father? Who or what helped me achieve a good life? And why have I created the Barb and Bud Hammes Rotary Scholarship? So I was born Bernard Joseph Hammes at St. Francis Hospital in La Crosse in 1950. My mom and dad were an older couple, and they thought they were beyond the age of childbearing, so I came as a complete surprise. My mom only finished 3rd grade, and my dad graduated from 8th grade. And it wasn't because they didn't value education. They did and instilled that in us. But the demands of their rural families up in St. Joseph Ridge required them to work on the farm. And so that's all the formal education that they had. So I was born into a family of 4 siblings. I was the 5th. But my brother was 16 years older. My one sister was 12. Another sister 6 and another sister 4. So I was kind of at the end, and I was almost like a second family for my parents. I grew up in a smaller home on the south side of La Crosse, so really a kind of a classic World War II house. The neighborhood was filled with kids, and all the parents are middle class and blue collar. My parents taught me to be giving. Here's a picture of my mom. And she's working at the Catholic thrift shop on the south side of La Crosse. As far as I can tell, one of the first thrift shops in La Crosse. It was part of the Catholic Daughters. They provided clothing at no or little charge to people in need. And the president is my dad. He's actually transferring a 4-wheel drive International Harvester pickup to a priest from the Diocese of La Crosse who was on his way to a mission, I believe, in Central America. So my family business was the Hammes Truck Sales and Service on 3rd and King. It's now called Trim Design, but my parents built that building for their business. And you can see that at that time there was a hotel on the corner, and behind the hotel was a boarding house. And my father tore these two buildings down to make room for his business. He needed a lot to put new and used trucks for sale. But in doing that, he displaced a lot of single men who were middle-aged or older, and they didn't have a place to live. I later learned that my dad kept 2 or 3 older used trucks on the back lot that he never locked. And one day, when we were kind of inspecting the business, he opened one of the doors and found this vomit all over the place. And I said, "What, Dad, why do you lock these cars?" And he said, "There's people who don't have a place to sleep." So he intentionally provided shelter as best he could to some of the men he probably displaced. But my parents, despite their education, were full of adventure. In 1955, I was 5 years old, and my two closest sisters, we took a 6-week vacation road trip to Mexico City. We went there to see the Shrine of Guadalupe. Now, these pictures are fuzzy because the only photos I have of this are my dad's 16 millimeter film. We also went to the Pyramid of the Sun. We got to climb up that. And it was the first time I saw another culture. I saw poverty. I saw people living in a very different way, and had a lot of fun doing it. But this really taught me a sense that the world is there. It's something you can enjoy, and to be curious and adventuresome. But to really understand my story, I think I have to go back a bit farther than my parents and talk about my immigrant ancestors. In 1851, Jacob and Anna Hammes left Mosterhausen, their village in west central Germany, with 5 children. In their crossing of the Atlantic, the youngest of the children, a 3-year-old daughter, died at sea and was buried at sea. They 2 weeks later, they arrived in New York City. And while I can't be sure, a common immigrant route to get to Wisconsin, Milwaukee, was to go by steam paddle wheel up the Hudson, through the Erie Canal, catch a steamship in the Great Lakes, and get to Milwaukee. When they got to Milwaukee, they used what money they had left to either purchase or rent some farmland outside of Milwaukee, where they resided for 2 years, saving up a bit more money. And then in 1853, Jacob and Anna headed west with the hope of homesteading on federal land. And when they got to West Salem, they held up for a few days to get new supplies and provisions. And they heard that there was land available in that area, so they looked around. And what you see in the white circle is the name Hammes, and it's right outside of Berry Mills. This was the original homestead of the Hammes family in our area. Best I can tell, they were able to claim 160 acres. And the rules at the time is that if you claimed the land and then lived on it for 5 years and showed improvement like a house and farming, then you could purchase that land for $1.20 an acre, which would have been about $192 for the whole thing. I asked AI to give me a figure of what that would be in today's dollars, and it would be $7,300, dirt cheap. Now, what's important about this is that this land was available only because in 1848, the U.S. Army had cleared this land of the native Ho-Chunk people. The U.S. Army had taken all of the Ho-Chunk in our region, brought them to La Crosse, put them on a paddle wheeler, and sent them north to a reservation in Minnesota. My family benefited from that. So why is this important? Well, my German ancestors were relatively poor, not well-educated people looking for a better life. They were leaving a depressed economy in Europe and an unsettled political climate. Coming to the United States was relatively straightforward. There was no visa required to get in. You just showed up in New York. And the immigration laws didn't really exist, except you had to reside in the United States for 5 years and pledge allegiance. You became a U.S. citizen automatically. And owning land was possible because of this federal land that was made available, and you only needed work. They were fortunate to have 4 strong sons to help them do that, and obviously they were successful. It's clear to me that the acquisition of this land created generational wealth, excuse me, that made it possible for my grandparents, the third generation, to get their own farm, and that my mother and father purchased their home and started a small business from scratch because of that family wealth. And this wealth allowed me and my kids to be prosperous as well. I went to high school in 64 and 68 at Aquinas. I call these my Berniers. Mike Desmond would know me by that name. A good Franciscan sister corrected me on my first day of school that my name was not Bud. That was a nickname, that my name was Bernie. And so almost everyone from high school knows me only as Bernie. It was a positive experience going to high school. Part of the reason is that because my family had this truck sales, I was one of the few kids who got a car as soon as I had a license. And not only did I get a car, but I had free maintenance and gas. I was a good athlete and had success at both football and track. During the summers, I worked at the family business, often assisting the mechanics, sweeping floors, or running for parts. And my senior year, I was elected both class president and captain of our football team. And there were a few other significant events. I met the love of my life. On your right, I guess, is Barb Becker, who I first saw at age 14 and started to date at age 15. Next to her is her good girlfriend, Patty Hass, who was actually my first date for homecoming my freshman year, but it was my way of getting to meet Barb. She's also my second cousin, I learned. What happened here? Okay. The other thing is that between junior and senior year of high school, I led a service project where we painted the exterior of a 2.5-story Victorian home for a family who was in economic distress. And after that, I was nominated to receive the Governor's Award, and here I'm receiving the Governor's Award for that service project from Warren Knowles. So it's kind of predating Habitat for Humanity. I attended college at the University of Notre Dame. Father Hesburgh was the president. I was initially an arts and architecture major, but switched to the general program of liberal studies, a three-year major that emphasized reading the great books, and it had a set curriculum featuring very small class seminars. The Vietnam War was raging, but I was deferred my first 2 years because I was attending college. And then when draft was determined by your birth date through a lottery, my birth date was well over 300, so I never even got near being drafted. My junior year, I lived at Monroe Seminary, the Holy Cross Priest Seminary, as a lay student. I came back as my junior year without a housing assignment and no apartment, thinking it would be easy to find an apartment. I was stupid. So as school started, I was literally homeless. I had no place to live. Some students had mercy on me and put me up for a few nights, but I went to the rector of Monroe Seminary, who had married Barb's parents and baptized Barb at Sacred Heart Church or Cathedral. And I begged him to let me live there for my junior year if I would just pay room and board. He did that. So I lived for the whole year, my junior year, in a seminary. And the opportunity is I got to have dinner with some of the leading faculty, priest faculty at the University of Notre Dame every night. It was wonderful. I also got to meet Joe Theismann in his underwear because the Notre Dame football team stayed at Monroe Seminary Friday nights before a home game because they needed a quiet place to sleep. He would sleep just down the hallway from me. And I was also awarded the Dockweiler Medal for the best senior essay in philosophy my senior year. The title of that essay is Saying and Showing, a Structural Analysis of Wittgenstein's Tractatus. Oops, I went the wrong way. And, sorry, I got married. So Barbara and I married in the middle of our senior year at Christmas break. which meant that we each went back to our own universities after we got married and lived separately. But Barb may be the only woman to have university approval to sleep in a dorm with a male student at Notre Dame. With me, of course. And just as a curious fact, this was the last year Notre Dame had an all-male undergraduate class. So I have that distinction, not a very good one. And I want to talk a little bit about summer jobs. This is a little curious, but I think it's a kind of important part of the story. After high school, during the summer, I worked at many different summer jobs, but all very well-paying summer jobs. I worked at Ed Phillips and Sons. It was a retail business, or wholesale business that dealt with, sold booze and tobacco products. Actually, it operated out of what we now call the Radisson Center. That used to be a warehouse and a distribution center, and I worked there for the Ed Phillips and Sons. I worked at Trane Plant 6, which is now torn down, but it manufactured small air conditioning compressors. I worked at Heilman's Bottling House. I worked at the Boys and Girls Club of Greater La Crosse. And one summer I worked out in New York at the Boys Club of New York at their summer camp, Harriman Base Camp. Here's the picture of me at that camp with my fellow counselor Gerhard, who is from Germany, and some of the summer camps. Now, the point of telling you this is that because of family connections and friends, I got these good paying summer jobs, and I earned enough every summer to pay half of my tuition and room and board at a private school. And because of our family business and the property we own, my mom earned enough to pay for the other. So I got through a private school with no debt. And that makes a big difference when you graduate. After graduation, Barb and I started living together, but we were off to Afghanistan almost immediately as we accepted a position in the Peace Corps. Barb and I are here at the home of our landlady's family home outside of Kabul. Unfortunately, this assignment only lasts about 8 weeks as Barb got very sick from overwhelming asthma, and we moved back to La Crosse. When we moved back, Barb, being a nurse, got employment almost immediately at Lutheran Hospital in their pediatric ward, but my liberal arts degree was a little harder to find employment. But I had connections, I had friends, and someone found me and opened a door, and I gained employment at the Trane Company head office and in their international liaison unit. I worked at Trane Company for 10 months, but while I was doing that, I was reapplying for graduate school to get a PhD in philosophy. I hope to be readmitted to the University of Texas, Austin. I had been accepted there, but declined that acceptance to go to Afghanistan. And when I applied the second time, I assumed I would be accepted, and I was not. And there's a kind of interesting story I don't have time to tell about that. In the distress of not being accepted, I went to Notre Dame to talk with faculty I knew about next steps and their advice. When I met with the chairman of the philosophy department, he said, "Why don't you come here? You can start this fall and I'll give you a full scholarship." So I started at Notre Dame without applying. That summer, the summer of '73, Barb and I lived and worked at Camp Birch Trail outside of Minong, Wisconsin. This was a summer camp for Jewish girls who came for 8 weeks. And this is me with the trunks that had to go back to the Minneapolis airport with the girls so they could fly back to Shreveport, Louisiana, St. Louis, Los Angeles. I was in charge of the logistics. So I started graduate school in 1973 to 77. During that time, Barb and I bought our first house for $12,500 and had our first child. Two of my closest friends during that experience in graduate school were master carpenters who taught me a whole lot about the trades that helped me fix up this house and several others that came after. Barb and I spent the summer of 1976 in Chicago while Barb collected data for her master's thesis in maternal and child health. And we lived just a few blocks from Lincoln Park and had a great summer together as I studied for my comprehensive exams. Barb later became the first certified nurse midwife in Indiana. In 1977 to 1980, we moved to Spokane, where I taught in the undergraduate program at Gonzaga University. We bought another house out there, which I also fixed up. And when we sold it in 1980, I made more money from the sale of that house than I did for teaching for 3 years. When we moved back to La Crosse in 1980, I became a house husband. Barb supported the family by practicing nurse midwifery at Gunderson Clinic and Lutheran Hospital. I was at home full-time, caring for the kids and the homestead and doing home improvements. And at that time, that role was considered so unusual, it landed me a full spread in the La Crosse Tribune, which is part of this picture. I was the only male at child's story time at the La Crosse Public Library. But during this time, I was also a community volunteer at the Lutheran Hospital IRB Human Subjects Committee, which is important in the next chapter here. During the 80 to 84 period, we had our third child, Joe, who's sitting right here. We adopted a fourth child who was born in Korea. He was 4 years old when we picked him up at O'Hare Airport in the summer of 1983. So at that time, our kids were 6, 5, 4, and 2.5. Caring for kids is both amazing and stressful, as any parent knows. And at times I did feel overwhelmed, but I love this responsibility and role. But I was repeatedly asked, and some of the women would probably maybe laugh at this, by any social engagement, someone would say, "But you're looking for work, right?" No one could believe that someone might choose to do this, although I did. And then in 84, a really unexpected twist of fate occurred. As our children were out of diapers, nearly all in school full-time, and my extensive remodeling work on our 17th Street house was almost done, I started to think about part-time employment. And I spoke with Reverend Dan Vinges, the chair of the hospital IRB. During my time at Gonzaga, my favorite group of students to teach were RNs returning to get their bachelor's degree. I really liked these students. They were interesting, they were enthusiastic, and had life experience. And I thought it might be fun to offer like ethics seminars at Lutheran Hospital, and I asked Dan about that. And a couple weeks later, he came back and had a different idea for me. He had just talked with Dr. Edwin Overholt, Director of Medical Education at the Gunderson Medical Foundation. And he said, "Would you be interested in creating a program in ethics for the house staff at Lutheran Hospital?" So I developed a proposal, and Dr. Overholt liked my proposal and said that he didn't want it just for the internal medicine residents, but he also wanted it for the other residencies, in particular the general surgery program. And he asked me to go to talk with Dr. Kiskin, Director of General Surgery Program at Lutheran Hospital. To my surprise, I succeeded in convincing Dr. Kiskin. Then Dr. Overholt had to find money to pay for this position. And so he took my proposal and pitched it to the Gunderson Medical Foundation board. The president of the board at that time was John Mooney. And I'm told John Mooney asked, "How much do you need?" And a number was provided, and John Mooney pulled out his checkbook, wrote out a check for the full amount, and gave it to Dr. Overholt to pay for and fund the first 2 years of my part-time position at Gunderson. That's the power of philanthropy. So I was on a probational 2-year period, and Dr. Overholt let me know that almost every instant he could. But because I think he wanted to say, don't get too comfortable here. But at the end of the 2-year probation, Dr. Overholt did an assessment of the outcomes and viewpoints of this program, and a decision was made to make it permanent and full-time. The foundation would fund half the cost, and the other half would be funded by the hospital. And I was considered a member of the medical staff. My role consisted of providing a range of services, including education of all employees, but focused on house staff, helping resolve patient-related ethical conflicts and uncertainties, chairing the new ethics committee, organizing the ethics of research, and finding ways to reduce ethical conflict. One of the ethical conflicts that I was working on, even at that time, was how to do end-of-life decision-making with hemodialysis patients. These patients on a life-sustaining treatment often became incompetent towards the end of their life and couldn't make their own decisions. We developed an advanced care planning program for this population that basically eliminated the conflict because we always knew what the patient wanted. During this time, the leaders of the 4 major health organizations were in frequent conversation. They were meeting on a frequent basis, trying to figure out how they could legally collaborate to improve the healthcare in our community. An idea was proposed in that group that we take the lessons learned in this hemodialysis advanced care planning program and try to apply it to the whole community. Then in 1990, I received a letter from the heads of the 4 local health organizations directing me to head up a community task force to develop an advanced care planning program for our region. The program was branded Respecting Choices. We did 2 large population studies, one in 95 and 96, and one 10 years later, that demonstrated the success of this program. I don't have time to go through that data right now, but there are copies of this book out in the front that you can take, and you can read more about it if you choose. It's a book I edited that compiles a lot of the literature around respecting choices. But we did get 2 articles published in peer-reviewed journals demonstrating this. When those articles were published, Respecting Choices became nationally and internationally known. The program was adopted by health systems across the United States, Canada, Germany, Australia, and Singapore. And my job really changed. I became a consultant and a Respecting Choices leader. This led to some interesting things, like every major news outlets came. This is Harry Smith from CBS. I got to do a TV show, a comedy show where Adam does Adam ruins everything. In this case, Adam ruins death. And we got the Tribeca Award for Disruptive Award at the Tribeca Film Festival in New York City. The Tribeca Film Festival is headed by Robert De Niro, among others. Barbara and I moved to Sparta, where she set up nurse midwifery. We got 3 of our 4 kids off to college, and we then moved back to Alaska when Barb retired. After Barb retired, she went and took a short-time position at Doctors of the World. I joined her, and I developed a community education program for tuberculosis. The guys in the green are removing mines, and the picture over here is a mass grave. Respecting Choices was spun off from Gunderson to its separate own non-for-profit. I headed that up until 2020, but COVID basically ended the success of that program. There just was no money left for anyone, and they never came back. I ended my employment in December 31st, 2020, but I never thought of it as retirement. I really thought of it as a transition to another way of being in the world. And then, so Barb and I were looking forward to neither of us being employed and having more time, but Barb was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the August of 2020. And over the next month, she, during COVID, she underwent chemotherapy, radiation, and surgery. And in June of 2021, Barb seemed to be cancer-free. But a CT scan on July 1st showed that she had spread of her cancer to her liver. She was admitted to hospice and died on August 12th, 2021. So while I grieve deeply for the loss of Barb, I have enormous gratitude for the abundance of our life journey together. I've come to recognize that so much of my success has been possible because of generational wealth that was achieved in part because of Native people were displaced. Being supported by family, friends, and mentors who opened doors at times that I needed them. and of learning from my parents the importance of sharing and giving, as well as curiosity and adventure. I had all of these winds in my sail. And because of these advantages and values that I've learned from my family and my community, I felt compelled to share this generational wealth with others in our community. And that was really the story behind my setting up the Hamas Rotary Scholarship Fund. Thanks.
Do you have more slides about the fund?
No.
No. Okay. Thank you, Bud.